Kairete if I'm speaking to many of my students, or Kaire if I'm just speaking to one of you. This is Professor Silverblank's video tutorial about accenting Enclitics. And in this tutorial, we are going to define Enclitics. We are going to go through the rules about accenting them. And then we're going to look at some examples and finally try to apply the rules to see if we can figure out where some accent should go on some real enclitic words that are following or followed by non-enclitics. So let's begin. The definition of an enclitic is a word that leans on the previous word, so that's right here in the definition, a word that leans on the previous word in the sentence or phrase to determine how it is accented. So again, enclitics get their accents from the previous word. We're going to call that word one. So let's jump right into it and get to the first rule, which we might call magical accent surplus. And I call it that because this is one of the fun ways that you can see a word have two accents. So normally we've learned that words only have one accent, and that accent can only ever fall on one of the last three syllables. But there's an exception to this. Provided by Rule A or Alpha or Rule 1, magical accent surplus. So we will see two accents on one word if word one, and remember word one is the phrase that we're using to describe the word that comes before the enclitic. So if word one has either an acute on the antepenult, an acute on the third to last syllable, or a circumflex on the penult. So a circumflex on the second to last syllable. So if we have either of these circumstances in word one, and word one is followed by an enclitic, then we're going to see two accents on that word. And here's how it works. So under these circumstances, an acute gets added to the ultima, or the last syllable of word one, and the enclitic gets no accent. So we end up with one word with two accents, that's word one, and the enclitic, which we also might call word two, gets no accent. So all the accents for word one, no accents for word two. So we can look at a couple of examples. In anthropos Amy, we can see that word one has either an acute on the antepenult or circumflex on the penult. So in the normal accentuation of this word one, anthropos, you would see the word spelled like this. Anthropos, with an acute on this syllable, which if we count back from the back, so this is syllable, that's the ultima, this syllable is the penult, and this syllable is the antepenult. So we have an acute on the antepenult. So that's why we have two accents on anthropos and no accent on Amy. Let's look at the second example. Douron esti. Douron is normally spelled like this. Douron. So this is the ultima, this is the penult, and this is the circumflex. So we have a circumflex on the penult. So this meets the conditions of Rule Alpha, magical accent surplus, because there's a circumflex on the penult of word one, and it's followed by an enclitic. So that allows us to keep our circumflex on the penult and add an acute on the ultima. And this may be surprising that we would add an acute here on the ultima when there's a word following, because normally when you have an acute on an ultima, it will change to a grave. A grave, which looks like an acute, but goes in the other direction. But as we know, enclitics are very exceptional, and when enclitics follow words, they don't force those words to change their acutes to graves. So this has been rule 1 or rule alpha, and this is a rule about when you come up with a situation where you see 2 accents on one word. And we've seen that those 2 accents can either be 2 acutes or a circumflex and an acute. Okay, rule 2 or rule beta. The enclitic gets an accent. So when we were hanging out with rule alpha, word 1 was getting all of the accents and the enclitic was getting none. But here's a rule that deals with the enclitic getting an accent. So let's read the rule. When word 1, so the word that comes before the enclitic, has an acute on the penult, which is the second to last syllable, and it's followed by a 2-syllable enclitic, then word 2, which is the enclitic, gets or has an accent on the ultima. And there's no change to word 1. So under the circumstances when word 1 has an acute on the penult and word 2 is a 2-syllable enclitic, then the enclitic gets an accent on the ultima and word 1 gets nothing special. So let's look at our example. Xanoi, asin. Xanoi is our word 1. And its accent is an acute, and it's falling on not the last syllable, but the second to last syllable, which is the penult. So we do have an acute on the penult, and the second word is an enclitic that has 2 syllables. So in this circumstance, word 1 stays the same, and the enclitic gets an accent on the ultima. Okay, so now we're on to our third rule, rule gamma. And this is very linked to the previous rule, rule beta. So we were just talking about enclitics getting an accent on the ultima when word 1 has an acute on the penult. So this is the situation in which an enclitic doesn't get an accent. So when word 1 has an accent on the penult, but it's followed by a 1-syllable enclitic rather than a 2-syllable enclitic, then word 2, which is the enclitic, has no accent. So xenos has an accent that's an acute, and it's on the penult because it's the second to last syllable. And the enclitic here, word 2, is only 1 syllable. Then it can't get an accent. So this is very related to the last rule, because if tis were 2 syllables, then it would get an accent. But not this time, because tis is a 1-syllable word. I call rule delta, or rule 4, ultimate consistency, because it's about things staying the same on the ultima. Okay. So let's read this rule. When word 1, the word that comes before the enclitic, has an accent on the ultima, this accent stays put, and it doesn't change to a grave. So I mentioned this before. Normally, you'd expect an acute to change to a grave, but it won't here. You wouldn't expect a circumflex to change to a grave, though, and it certainly won't when word 1 is followed by an enclitic. But the real point is here that when there's an accent on the ultima of word 1 and word 2 is the enclitic, then that accent stays put and it doesn't change. So let's look at 2 examples. The first one, teos estin. So teos is word one, and it has an accent on the ultima, and that accent is an acute. And it's followed by an enclitic. Note that the accent stays the same and doesn't change to a grave. In our second example, teu eisen. This circumflex is an accent on the ultima, and it stays put, and it doesn't change to anything. It doesn't change to a different kind of accent. It doesn't change its position. It just stays consistent. We're rule delta, ultimate consistency. This is a pretty easy one. When word one has an accent on the ultima, it's gonna stay put, and it's not gonna change. Rule epsilon, or rule 5. Ultimate consistency, so there's a theme continuing from the last rule, and enclitic gets no accent. So this one's pretty straightforward. Again, when word one has an accent on the ultima, the enclitic doesn't get an accent. Simple as that. So let's look at our examples. Teon, tinon. Tinon is our enclitic. Teon is word one. Word one has an accent on the ultima. The enclitic gets nothing. Example 2. Teoi, eisen. Again, we have an accent on word one's ultima. There's an acute here. It doesn't change to a grave, which we learned from rule delta. And enclitic gets no accent. And this rule applies whether word one's ultima has an acute, like teoi, or a circumflex, like teon. It's true in either circumstance. This is our 6th and final rule for today's lesson. Rule sigma, or 6, the battle of the enclitics. Nice guys finish last. So this rule has to do with when you have multiple enclitics in a row, which does happen. So when you have multiple enclitics in a row, the first ones are accented and the last one remains unaccented. So that's why I called it nice guys finish last, because when the last one lets the other one go first, the last one gets no accent. Okay, let's take a look at this example from Thucydides. Pu, tis, tina, idoi, ekthron. So you can see that I've underlined the 3 enclitics, pu, tis, and tina. And according to the rule, when you have multiples in a row, the first ones, pu and tis, are accented, and the last one, tina, remains unaccented. We could go into more detail for this in the more advanced tutorials and accenting enclitics, perhaps we will, but for now, let's just turn to some examples where we can try to apply our rules. Okay. Example 1, logoi tines. So the first step, before we even get to our accent rules, is we want to know how these words are normally accented. So we know that tines, because it's an enclitic, is going to be the weird one, but logoi is going to be fairly straightforward. So let's refresh our memories on how logoi is accented. So when we were learning our vocabulary, the dictionary entry for this word was logos, logu, ho, and we remembered that noun accents are persistent. So this accent, which is an acute on the penult, will like to stay there in as much as is possible. So let's just go ahead and draw our little acute on the penult. Now it's time to see if rule 1 or rule alpha applies. Okay, rule alpha was magical accent surplus, which meant that it was dealing with circumstances under which you have more than one accent on word 1. So logoi would be the relevant word here. So we will see 2 accents on one word if word 1 has either an acute on the antepenult. Well, logoi is only 2 syllables, so it doesn't have an antepenult. Or 2, a circumflex on the penult. So it doesn't have a circumflex on the penult, it has an acute. So rule alpha is basically irrelevant. Let's move on. Rule beta deals with when the enclitic gets an accent. And the circumstances for that to happen are the following. So word 1 needs to have an acute on the penult, and it needs to be followed by an enclitic that has 2 syllables. So let's take a look. Word 1, logoi, does it have an acute on the penult? Here's the penult, and yes, there's an acute. The enclitic, is it 2 syllables? Why, yes, it is. So under these circumstances, when word 1 has an acute on the penult and the enclitic is 2 syllables, then what happens is the enclitic gets an accent. And where does it get its accent? On the ultima. So let's go ahead and put that in right there. And here is how we accent logoi tines. Example 2, estin anthropos. So as we began last time, we need to start by recalling how our non-enclitic word is normally accented. So our enclitic is estin and anthropos is not our enclitic. So that's normally anthropos with an acute on the alpha. Okay, the next thing I notice is that our regular word that isn't an enclitic, anthropos, actually comes second in this phrasing. So it's estin anthropos, not anthropos estin. So this doesn't get to be called word 1, and estin doesn't get to lean on it for its accent. So if enclitics lean on the previous word for their accent, and they don't normally come first in the sentence, we're in a bit of a pickle. But esti and a few other enclitics and other forms of esti can come first in a sentence for emphasis and are accented normally. Now, if estin is not leaning on word 1, because there is no word 1, it is accented like this. And anthropos gets to be totally itself and undergo no changes because it's not followed by an enclitic. So our final answer is estin anthropos. Example 3, anthropos estin. So we're hanging out with the same words here, except in a different order, and that's going to change things for us. So our first word, anthropos, as we recall, is accented normally like anthropos. So let's see what's happening here. We know the normal accentuation. Now we have to check rule alpha, which is the fun rule about magical accent surplus that can happen under the circumstances that word 1, anthropos, has an acute on the antepenult or a circumflex on the penult. Let's take a look. So there's an acute here, and this is the ultima. This is the penult. This is the antepenult. So we have an acute on the antepenult. So we do get magical accent surplus happening here. And what happens is we stick an extra acute on the ultima. Let's go right ahead and do that. And when we do that, when we put this extra acute on the ultima of word 1, we have 2 accents here, and the enclitic itself gets no accent. So this is the final answer, anthropos estin. Example 4, boule tis. Okay, so our first shot is that we have to figure out the accent of boule because tis is our enclitic. So let's refresh our memories. How is boule normally accented? Like this, boule, boules, hey. Okay, so let's take a look at our accent rules. Alpha, accent surplus, which occurs when word 1 has an acute on the antepenult or a circumflex on the penult. What do we have with boule? Well, we have an acute and it's on the ultima. So neither of these apply. Rule alpha, let's throw it away. But what about rule beta? To review, rule beta is that an enclitic gets an accent when word 1 has an acute on the penult and the enclitic has 2 syllables. So our word 1 has an acute, but it's on the ultima, and our enclitic is only 1 syllable. So this rule is useless to us. Let's move on. Moving on to rule gamma. Rule gamma is about when the enclitic gets no accent under the circumstances when word 1 has an acute on the penult and the enclitic is 1 syllable. Well, our enclitic is 1 syllable, but still word 1 does not have an acute on the penult, so rule gamma is useless too. Let us once again move on. Now rule delta looks a bit promising because it's called ultimate consistency. So rule delta is that when word 1 has an accent on the ultima, which our word does, boule, the acute doesn't change to a grave, and the accent stays where it is. So this boule is going to stay put. But what about our enclitic? Does it get an accent? Well, rule delta didn't tell us much about that, but let's turn to rule epsilon, which tells us it's sort of the continuation of ultimate consistency. And in this rule, we learn that if word 1 has an accent on the ultima, then the enclitic gets no accent. Poor enclitic. So this stays as it is. Boule tis. And this is our final answer. Example 5. Xanoi esmen. So our first step is going to be figuring out what the normal accentuation of the word xanoi would be. So xanoi is from xanos, xanu, ho. So the normal accentuation is on the penult, and it's an acute, so we'll stick an acute on xanoi. All right, so now that we have that, it's time to check rule alpha. Rule alpha is that magical accent surplus rule, and there will be magical accent surplus when you either have an acute on the antepenult or a circumflex on the penult. So in xanoi, we don't have either of those things. We have an acute on the penult. So let's leave rule 1 in the dust and move on. Rule beta teaches us about when the enclitic gets an accent. So if word 1 has an acute on the penult and it's followed by a 2-syllable enclitic, so the enclitic has 2 syllables, in that circumstance, then word 2, the enclitic, gets an accent on the ultima. So we must ask ourselves, do we meet these conditions? Well, word 1 does seem to have an acute on the penult, and the enclitic is 2 syllables. So in this example, we can wholeheartedly throw an acute on the ultima of the enclitic. Xanoi esmen. Excellent. And we don't need to look at any of the rest of our rules because rule gamma deals with when the enclitic gets no accent, and that's already irrelevant because we've given the enclitic an accent. Rule delta is about ultimate consistency, so things staying the same when word 1 has an accent on the ultima, but that's not relevant here. And then rule epsilon deals with the same thing. Rule sigma deals with the battle of the enclitics, so when you have multiple enclitics in a row, and we don't have that here, so we're all sorted. Xanoi esmen is our final result. Example 6, boules tinos. Okay, so our normal starting place, figuring out the accent, the usual accent of word 1. So boules is from boule, boules, which normally has a circumflex over the eta on the ultima. So that's where we normally hang out. So we can think about rule alpha, which is about magical accent surplus, But that only has to do with acutes on antepenults and circumflex on penults. So because we're dealing with accentuation on the ultima, rule alpha is irrelevant. Rule beta is when the enclitic gets an accent, and rule beta indicates that the enclitic gets an accent when word 1 has an acute, and it has an acute on the what? The penult. Well, that's not relevant here because we have a circumflex on the ultima, so let's throw this rule out. Rule gamma is in similar territory. It deals with when word 1 has an acute on the penult. Well, again, that's not really relevant here, so we can go ahead and throw out rule gamma. Now, if we were very clever, we could have skipped right ahead to rule delta, which is ultimate consistency, which tells us that when word 1 has an accent on the ultima, which it does here, this accent stays put and doesn't change. Okay, that's rule delta. So boulez stays boulez. But what about the enclitic? Rule epsilon tells us a little bit more about this circumstance. So when there's ultimate consistency, so when word 1 has an accent on the ultima, then the enclitic, unfortunately for the enclitic, gets no accent. It's not accented. So everything stays the same. That's again why it's called ultimate consistency. So boulez to nos is exactly how we're going to leave it. For example 6. We've finished accenting this one. Example 7. Teoi este. So if we take a moment to think about the normal accentuation of teoi, it's from what word? Teos, teu, ha, he. It's common gender. So normally teos and teu, we see that the accent wants to be on the ultima. But we don't yet know if it's going to be an acute or circumflex. Let's take a moment to think. Teoi. Should it be an acute or circumflex? Accent rules of nouns dictate that it should be an acute. So teoi. If it were genitive or dative, singular or plural, then it would be a circumflex. But because it's nominative and because that oi diphthong is a short ending, although it's a long syllable when it's followed by consonants, it gives us an acute here. So let us check rule alpha. Rule alpha, as we recall, deals with magical accent surplus, which occurs when word 1 has an acute on the antepenult, which teoi does not have. It has an acute on the ultima. Or a circumflex on the penult, which this doesn't have. So rule alpha is out, and there's not going to be magical accent surplus. Rule beta is a rule that tells us about when the enclitic gets an accent. And the circumstance that rule beta outlines is when word 1 has an acute, and that acute falls on the penult. Well, unfortunately, our acute is on the ultima, so rule beta is out. Rule gamma also deals with word 1 having an acute on the penult, so rule gamma is also out. Once again, if we were clever, we might have thought, well, I know that this word, deoi, has an accent on the ultima, so let's just skip ahead to rule delta. Ultimate consistency. So when word 1 has an accent on the ultima, then we say sit, stay, accent, and it stays there. So the acute on teoi will stay there, but we still have to ask ourselves, what of the enclitic? Does the enclitic get an accent? Well, rule epsilon tells us, and this is a continuation of ultimate consistency, that when word 1 has an accent on the ultima, then the enclitic gets no accent. It is not accented. Sorry, enclitic, but teoi, este is our final result. Example 8, anthropou tenos. Okay, so our word 1 is from anthropos, anthropou, which is accented as such. So since the form we're working with is anthropou, then we can go ahead and put our acute on the penult. So beginning with rule alpha, which is magical accent surplus, the circumstances that we need to get that surplus are when word 1 has an acute on the antepenult or a circumflex on the penult. Neither of these circumstances are true. What we do have is an acute on the penult, but that's not relevant for rule alpha, so let's throw it away. Rule beta. So rule beta is the one that tells us when the enclitic gets an accent. And the circumstance has to be that word 1 has an acute, and it has that acute on the penult. So that's circumstance 1. And then circumstance 2 is if the enclitic is 2 syllables. If both of those things are the case, then word 2, the enclitic, gets an accent on the ultima. In our word 1, there is an acute on the penult, and in our enclitic, we have 2 syllables. So, what do you know? We get an accent on the ultima of the enclitic. Great news. Example 9. So our first word, our word 1 is doron, and our second word is ti. And doron is normally accented doron. So we'll add the circumflex there and see which rules apply. So rule alpha, magical accent surplus, comes into play when there is an acute on the antepenult. Well, we don't have an antepenult, but rule alpha applies also when there's a circumflex on the penult, and we do have that. So what happens here? An acute is added to the ultima of word 1, and the enclitic gets no accent. So what we end up with doron ti is doron ti. So an acute is added to the ultima of word 1, and the circumflex stays put, and the enclitic gets no accent. Example 10 is our 10th and final example for this tutorial today. And our words are teon tis. So if we recall, we've already met forms of teos in these exercises. And teos, teu, is accented on the ultima. And in the genitive plural, it's a circumflex accent that we get. So I'd like to go ahead and skip rule alpha about magical accent surplus because it only applies to word 1 when word 1 has an acute on the antepenult or circumflex on the penult, but we know that our accent is on the ultima. Rule beta also has to do with acutes on penults. Since our accent is a circumflex on the ultima, we can skip that. Rule gamma also has to do with acutes on penults, so we can skip that and go straight to ultimate consistency, rule delta. Ultimate consistency applies when word 1 has an accent on the ultima, the accent stays put. So that's what rule delta tells us, but it doesn't tell us anything particular about what happens to our enclitic. So we'll have to move along to rule epsilon for that. Rule epsilon is a continuation of ultimate consistency, and then it also has to deal with the enclitic. And rule epsilon happens to be called enclitic gets no accent, so you can guess where this is going. But the rule epsilon is basically this. When word 1 has an accent on the ultima, the enclitic doesn't get an accent. And that's it. So, theon tis, as we've marked it up, is how it's going to be. And that's our final answer for our final example. Thanks for tuning in to this video tutorial about accenting Enclitics. This has been sort of the basics round. And this will provide you with pretty much everything you need to know for general use of Enclitics and accents, but we haven't talked about some of the more finer points of detail, and that's fine. We will come to that later in class as they come up, but now hopefully some of these rules have begun to concretize in your head, knowing that rule alpha is about magical accent surplus. That's the circumstance under which more than one accent ends up on word one, and that's when there's an acute on the antepenult or the circumflex on the penult. Then you can throw an extra acute on the ultima. Then rule beta has to do with Enclitics getting their accent, and that happens when an acute falls on the penult in word one and the Enclitic is 2 syllables. So that's under those circumstances, the Enclitic gets an accent on the ultima with no change to word one. Rule gamma is similar to rule beta, but the difference is that in rule gamma, the Enclitic gets no accent. So when word one has an acute on the penult, and is followed by a 1-syllable Enclitic rather than a 2-syllable Enclitic, then the Enclitic gets no accent. Rule delta is ultimate consistency. I like this rule. It's very linked to rule epsilon. So I'll explain them together. We just met them. When word one has an accent on the ultima, that accent stays put and doesn't change. And additionally, when you have that circumstance, the Enclitic gets no accent. The final rule, which we didn't really see an example of, is rule sigma. And I called that the battle of the Enclitics. And when you have multiple Enclitics in a row, the first ones are accented and the last one is unaccented. And that's the final rule that we covered today. So thanks again for tuning in. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. In my office, in the classroom every morning, or at hsilverby@haverford.edu. Kairate.